In the luxurious ballroom where they had laughed at her, a single sentence translated into 3 languages was all it took to silence the powerful. The waitress who knew the past became the voice of the future, and the most influential man in the city discovered that what she carried in her heart could not be contained in any contract. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the dining room of the Onyx Room, a harbinger of what was to come. Sophia Miller, 25, watched the fragments of the red wine glass scatter across the white marble floor, staining it like drops of blood. Her hands trembled, not from the accident, but from the words she had just overheard from the main table. These neighborhood waitresses have no class. How could they possibly understand international business? The cruel laughter of Mr. Peterson, a partner at the most powerful firm in Illinois, cut through the air like a knife. They're better off just serving tables and staying out of adult conversations. Sophia clenched her fists, feeling the heat rise up her neck, flushing her cheeks a deep pink that contrasted with her fair skin. Her green eyes, usually sweet and expressive, now flashed with a mix of humiliation and contained fury. It wasn't the first time she'd been treated this way, but tonight was different. Tonight, she had understood every word they had spoken in English, French, and Italian during their negotiations, and what she had discovered left her breathless. The young woman bent down slowly to pick up the pieces of glass, her hands still shaking. Her light brown hair, pulled back in a simple bun, slipped over her shoulder as she worked. She was beautiful in an understated way, with delicate features that spoke of an inner strength few bothered to see. Her lips, normally curved in a kind smile, were now a tight line of determination. "Let me help you," murmured a deep, masculine voice she didn't recognize. Sophia looked up and met a pair of blue eyes that watched her with an intensity that made her forget where she was for a moment. The man before her was tall, athletically built, dressed in a black suit that probably cost more than her 3-month salary. His black hair was perfectly combed back, and his face, with its sharp features and strong jaw, had the kind of masculine beauty seen on magazine covers. "It's not necessary, sir," she replied automatically, her voice barely a whisper as she continued to gather the fragments. "It was my fault." "No," he said firmly, kneeling beside her, unconcerned that his expensive suit might get stained. "The fault lies with whoever made you so uncomfortable that you were trembling." His fingers brushed against hers as they both reached for the same piece of glass, and Sophia felt an electric shock that made her pull back as if burned. "Who are you?" she asked, studying his face with curiosity. She hadn't seen him in the restaurant before, and he definitely wasn't the kind of man who went unnoticed. "Alexander Montgomery," he answered, and Sophia felt the world stop around her. That name. She had seen that surname before, engraved on gold plaques on old documents her grandmother kept like treasures. "And you are—" "No one important," she murmured, quickly standing up and moving away from him as if he were dangerous, because he was. Alexander Montgomery was the CEO of Montgomery Enterprises, the most powerful company in the Midwest, the man whose face was in business magazines and whose fortune was legendary. What was a man like him doing in a restaurant like this, kneeling on the floor helping a waitress pick up broken glass? "That's not true," he said, following her as she headed to the kitchen with the fragments in a napkin. "A moment ago, you were translating what they were saying at the business table. Your French is perfect, and your Italian has an accent that suggests you've studied it formally." Sophia stopped in her tracks, turning to face him with wide eyes. "How did you know?" "Because I was watching you," he admitted without shame. "All night, the way you frowned when they mentioned certain figures, how you nodded involuntarily when they talked about market strategies. You're not just a waitress, are you?" The question hung in the air between them like a taut rope about to snap. Sophia looked into his eyes, seeing a genuine curiosity she hadn't experienced before. Most people looked at her and made assumptions based on her work uniform, her humble background, her youth. But this man had been truly watching her, had noticed things no one else bothered to see. "I studied translation and interpretation at Northwestern University," she finally admitted, her voice barely audible. "But the scholarships ran out when my grandmother got sick, and I had to drop out in my last semester to take care of her and work." "And now?" he asked, taking a step closer, close enough for her to smell his cologne, an expensive masculine scent that made her a little dizzy. "Now she's gone," Sophia replied, feeling the familiar lump in her throat that always appeared when she spoke of her grandmother, Eleanor. "And I'm still here serving tables and listening to men like Mr. Peterson say that women like me have no education." Alexander frowned, and for a moment his expression hardened in a way that made Sophia feel small. "What exactly did you hear from that conversation?" The question sounded casual, but there was something in his tone that put Sophia on alert. "Why do you care?" "Because," he said, taking another step closer until she had to lift her head to look him in the eyes. That was my meeting. Those were my partners. And now I need to know what part of our confidential business a waitress who happens to be an unfinished professional interpreter understood. The air between them grew thick and tense. Sophia felt the color drain from her face as she grasped the magnitude of the situation. Not only had she unintentionally spied on an important business meeting, but she had been caught by the CEO of the company himself. Her mind raced, searching for a way out of a situation that could cost her not just her job, but also land her in serious legal trouble. I wasn't intentionally spying, she said quickly, backing away until her back hit the wall. I understand languages. I can't help but hear and comprehend, but I wouldn't tell anyone What did you hear? He insisted, his voice now colder, more like the ruthless businessman from the newspapers. Sophia swallowed, feeling like she was on the edge of a cliff. She could lie, pretend she hadn't understood anything, but something in Alexander's blue eyes told her he would know if she wasn't telling the truth. Besides, a rebellious part of her, the part she had inherited from her grandmother Eleanor, refused to shrink from intimidation. I heard that you're planning to expand into Europe using a series of patents acquired 30 years ago, she said finally, lifting her chin in a defiant gesture. Patents related to communications technology and automatic translation systems. Patents that, as Mr. Peterson mentioned, were acquired from some crazy old lady who didn't know what she had. Alexander's expression shifted subtly, as if he had seen something in Sophia's face he didn't expect. And does that sound familiar to you for some reason? My grandmother, Sophia murmured, feeling the pieces of a puzzle she had been trying to solve for years finally start to click into place, was named Eleanor Miller. And before she died, she used to talk about inventions she had created, about ideas that had been stolen from her. She said that one day someone would recognize her work. The silence that followed was deafening. Alexander looked at her with an intensity that made her feel as if she were being analyzed under a microscope. His blue eyes had turned as cold as ice, but there was something else in them. Surprise, recognition. Eleanor Miller, he repeated slowly, as if savoring the name. The woman who lived in Lincoln Park. The one with the house full of strange machines and books in different languages? You knew her? Sophia asked, her heart beating so hard she was sure he could hear it. I knew of her, Alexander replied carefully. My father mentioned her name from time to time. He said she had been a brilliant inventor, but unstable. She wasn't unstable, Sophia retorted fiercely, her green eyes flashing with indignation. She was a genius. She spoke 8 languages, had 3 university degrees, and had created things that were decades ahead of their time. But she was a woman, and in the 90s nobody took women inventors seriously. Sophia, Alexander said, and the way he pronounced her name with that deep, slightly husky voice sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with fear. Do you have any proof of what your grandmother invented? Why? She asked, suspicious. So you can take it from me, too. So you can prove you're right, he replied. And for the first time since he had revealed his identity, his voice sounded sincere. If your grandmother really created those technologies, if her ideas were truly stolen, then she deserves for the truth to be known. Sophia studied him for a long moment, trying to decipher his intentions. He was a dangerous man. She knew that instinctively. He had the power to ruin her life with a single phone call, but there was also something about him, a spark of genuine curiosity that made her think that maybe, just maybe, he could be an ally instead of an enemy. You have it, she said finally. All the proof is at my grandmother's house. Diaries, sketches, prototypes, even audio recordings where she explains how her inventions work. I saved everything after she died, though I never knew what to do with it. Would you be willing to show it to me? He asked, and something in his tone had changed again, becoming softer, almost seductive. Why should I trust you? She asked directly. Your company benefited from stealing my grandmother's ideas. Why would you want to help me prove you're all thieves? Alexander smiled for the first time since they had met, and the transformation was so dramatic that Sophia had to make a conscious effort not to sigh. His smile was devastating, completely changing his face and making his blue eyes sparkle with a warmth he hadn't shown before. Because, he said, taking another step closer, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. It turns out I hate being stolen from, and if someone used my family's name to steal your grandmother's ideas, I want to know about it. And what if you find out it was your own father who did it? Sophia asked, carefully watching his reaction. Alexander's smile faded, but he didn't look away. Then we'll have to decide what to do about it, don't you think? Before Sophia could answer, the shrill voice of the restaurant manager cut through the air. Miller, What are you doing standing there chatting? You have tables to wait on. Sophia jumped, suddenly remembering where she was and what she was supposed to be doing. She moved away from Alexander as if she had been doing something forbidden, which technically was true. I have to go, she murmured, not daring to look him in the eye. My shift doesn't end until 11. Wait, he said, gently taking her arm before she could pull away. His touch was warm and firm, and Sophia again felt that disconcerting electric jolt. What's your phone number? I don't have a phone, she lied, because the truth was, she had an old basic cell that barely worked, and she didn't want him to know how poor she really was. Then give me your address, he insisted. I want to see that proof you're talking about. Sophia hesitated. Giving her address to a stranger, especially a man as powerful as Alexander Montgomery, seemed insane. But something inside her, that same intuition that had served her well her whole life, told her to trust him. 247 West Armitage Avenue, Lincoln Park, she said quickly. But I can't see you until Sunday. I work every day until then. Sunday it is, he agreed, and when he smiled again, Sophia felt her knees turn to jelly. 2 in the afternoon, does that work for you? Yes, she whispered, wondering if she was making the biggest mistake of her life or the bravest decision she had ever made. Miller, the manager yelled again, and this time she sounded truly angry. I have to go, Sophia said, hurrying away from him, but not before hearing him say her name one more time, with that voice that made her stomach fill with butterflies. Until Sunday, Sophia. As she walked away toward her tables, feeling his gaze on her back, she couldn't help but wonder what had begun tonight. There was something about Alexander Montgomery that drew her in like a magnet, something dangerous and exciting that scared her as much as it thrilled her. The rest of her shift passed in a haze. She served tables, smiled at customers, cleaned spills, but her mind was completely focused on those blue eyes and the promise of answers she had seen in them. When she finally took off her apron and left the restaurant at 11, Alexander was gone, but he had left something on the table where he had been sitting, a white business card with gold lettering and a number handwritten on the back. Sophia tucked it into her purse as if it were a treasure, and all the way home on the bus she couldn't stop touching it to make sure it was still there, that she hadn't dreamed the whole encounter. When she arrived at the small house she had inherited from her grandmother in Lincoln Park, she went straight to Eleanor's study, a room she had kept exactly as her grandmother had left it. The walls were lined with shelves full of books in different languages, boxes of half-finished inventions, and photo albums documenting a life that had been far more extraordinary than most people had ever recognized. Sophia sat in her grandmother's old desk chair and opened the main drawer where she kept the most important documents. There they were, the contracts signed 30 years ago, the patents that had been temporarily transferred for evaluation, the letters from lawyers promising recognition and compensation that never came, and there on several of those documents was the name she now knew so well, Montgomery Enterprises. Sophia closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 30 years of injustice on her shoulders. Her grandmother had died believing no one would ever know the truth about her work, that her inventions would be lost to oblivion along with her name. But now, in the most unexpected way, an opportunity to change that had appeared. The question was, could she trust Alexander Montgomery to do the right thing, or was she walking straight into another betrayal? There was only one way to find out. Have you ever felt like fate puts you exactly where you need to be, even when you don't understand it? Tell us in the comments which city you're watching from, and don't forget to like this story if you want to know what secrets Sophia will uncover in her grandmother's documents. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single chapter of this story of love and justice. Chapter 2. Sunday arrived with a light rain that gently tapped against the windows of the Lincoln Park house. Sophia had spent the days since her encounter with Alexander in a state of constant nervousness, organizing and reorganizing her grandmother's documents, mentally preparing for what could be a life-changing confrontation. She had dressed carefully that morning, choosing a simple navy blue dress that had belonged to her grandmother, but which she had tailored to fit. It was modest yet elegant, and it made her feel connected to Eleanor in a way she desperately needed at that moment. Her hands trembled slightly as she applied a soft layer of lip gloss, wondering why she was getting so dressed up for a man she barely knew. At 2 o'clock sharp, the doorbell rang, and Sophia felt her heart stop for a second before it began to race. She walked to the door slowly, taking a deep breath to calm herself before opening it. Alexander stood on the small porch, sheltered from the rain. He had swapped his formal suit for dark jeans and a white button-down shirt that looked expensive but casual. His black hair was slightly damp from the rain, and when he smiled at her, Sophia felt her resolve to keep things strictly professional waver dangerously. "I thought maybe you wouldn't come," she admitted, stepping aside to let him in. "I thought about not coming," he answered honestly, shaking the rain from his shoulders. But curiosity got the better of caution. Sophia closed the door behind him and turned to find him observing the inside of the house with an expression of genuine fascination. The living room was filled with Eleanor's memories, photographs from her university days, framed diplomas on the walls, and several of her smaller inventions arranged as decorations. The atmosphere was warm and inviting, very different from the minimalist, cold spaces Alexander was used to. "Your grandmother had a PhD in engineering," he observed, reading one of the diplomas on the wall, "and another in linguistics. Impressive for a woman of her generation." "She had 3, actually," Sophia corrected, feeling a surge of family pride. "The third was in computer science, back when that field was just starting to exist in the US. She was a visionary." Alexander turned to her, and in his blue eyes was an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "Why did I never hear of her? If she was so brilliant, why isn't her name anywhere?" "Because she was a woman," Sophia replied simply, "and because she trusted the wrong people. Come on, I want to show you something." She led him down a small hallway to Eleanor's study, a room that had always been the heart of the house. The walls were covered with floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with books in Spanish, English, French, Italian, German, and even some in Japanese. There were 3 different desks, each dedicated to a specific project, and boxes meticulously labeled with dates and descriptions. "My God," Alexander murmured, turning slowly to take in the whole room. "It's like a mad scientist's lab." "Misunderstood genius would be more accurate," Sophia said with a sad smile. "Look at this." She went to the main desk and opened a large drawer, pulling out a metal box that looked handmade. These are the prototypes of her first inventions, the ones that were evaluated by Montgomery Enterprises in 1993. Alexander came closer, and Sophia was acutely aware of his presence beside her, the scent of his cologne mingling with the smell of old paper and wood that had always characterized her grandmother's study. With careful hands, he began to take out the contents of the box. "This," she said, holding up a device that looked like a cross between a calculator and a primitive phone, "is a prototype for an automatic translator. It could translate basic phrases between 5 different languages. In 1993, Alexander took the device carefully, examining it with the eye of someone who understood technology. "This is incredible. Did it actually work?" "Perfectly. See this blue button? Press it twice and say something in English." He followed her instructions, and after a moment, a robotic but clear voice repeated his phrase in Spanish. Alexander's eyes widened in surprise. "In 1993, this would have been revolutionary. Why wasn't it commercialized?" "Because your company told my grandmother it needed significant improvements before it could be launched," Sophia replied, her voice hardening slightly. "They asked her to hand over all the prototypes and technical documentation to optimize the design. She did, trusting it was a legitimate partnership, and they never returned them. Never. After 6 months, when she went to ask about the progress, they told her the project had been cancelled because it wasn't commercially viable. But they kept all her materials for legal reasons." Sophia continued to pull items from the box, detailed sketches of wireless communication systems, designs for user interfaces that were decades ahead of their time, and handwritten technical documents in a small, precise script that showed an understanding of technology that was extraordinary for her era. "Sophia," Alexander said after several minutes of examining the materials, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't identify, "do you have the exact dates when your grandmother handed over these prototypes?" Of course, Eleanor documented everything meticulously. Sophia went to a file cabinet and pulled out a thick folder full of legal documents. "Here are the original contracts, the delivery dates, the communications with the lawyers from Montgomery Enterprises, everything." Alexander reviewed the papers with growing tension, and Sophia noticed his knuckles turning white as he read. "This is signed by Richard Montgomery," he murmured finally. "My father. Do you recognize the signature?" "Yes," he answered in a tense voice. "And I recognize the style. My father was ruthless in business, but I never thought he was capable of something like this." Sophia watched him carefully, trying to read his expression. She had expected denial, maybe anger directed at her for accusing his family. But what she saw on Alexander's face was something different, a mix of shock, disappointment, and what looked like genuine shame. "There's more," she said softly, pulling out another box. "These are the audio recordings Eleanor made explaining how her inventions worked. She made them as a backup, in case something happened to the physical documents." She placed a small tape recorder on the desk and pressed play. Eleanor Miller's voice filled the room, clear and passionate as she explained the technical principles behind a real-time translation system that, according to her explanation, could revolutionize international communication. Alexander listened in silence, and Sophia couldn't help but notice the way his jaw tensed as the recording continued. When Eleanor began to explain how she had developed natural language processing algorithms years before the technology became mainstream, he closed his eyes as if in physical pain. "By the time I was 10, he said when the recording ended, my father was already using automatic translation technology in his companies. He said we had developed it in-house. He would take me to tech fairs to show off our innovative breakthroughs." "And now you know the truth," Sophia replied, watching him struggle with this new information. "Now I know that my family's legacy is built on the theft of your grandmother's work," he said bitterly. "Do you have any idea how much money that technology has generated over the years?" "I'm not interested in the money," Sophia said firmly. "It was never about the money." "Then what is it about?" "Recognition, respect. For history to remember Eleanor Miller's name as the brilliant inventor she was, not as a footnote in someone else's empire." Alexander looked at her for a long moment, and in his blue eyes was an intensity that made her feel as if he could see right into her soul. "What do you want me to do, Sophia? What do you expect from me?" It was the question she had been both dreading and hoping for. "I want you to do the right thing," she answered simply, "whatever that means to you." "And what if doing the right thing means destroying my family's reputation, publicly admitting that our initial success was based on the theft of intellectual property? And what if not doing it means another brilliant, innovative person never gets the credit they deserve?" she countered. "How many other Eleanor Millers are out there whose ideas were stolen because they didn't have the power or connections to protect themselves?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond their personal situation. Alexander walked to the window and stood there for several minutes, watching the rain that continued to fall softly. "My father died 5 years ago," he said finally, without turning to look at her. "We never had a particularly close relationship, but I always respected his work ethic, his determination to build something meaningful, to find out that it was all based on this." "I'm sorry," Sophia said softly, and she was surprised to realize she truly meant it. "I know what it's like to idolize someone, and then find out they weren't who you thought they were." Alexander turned to her. "Who did you idolize?" "My grandmother," she admitted with a sad smile. "For years I thought she just hadn't been smart enough or persistent enough to make her inventions work commercially. I thought maybe the stories about the theft were just the bitterness of an old woman who couldn't accept failure." "What made you change your mind?" "Finding all these documents after she died and realizing that she had meticulously documented every interaction, every promise, every disappointment. It wasn't bitterness, it was the truth." Alexander walked back to where she stood by the desk, and when he stopped in front of her, they were close enough for Sophia to see the small lines around his eyes that spoke of years of responsibility and difficult decisions. "What would you do?" he asked. "If you were in my position, what would you do?" It was a serious question, and Sophia took her time to consider it. "I think," she said finally, "that the truth always finds a way to come out. The question is whether you want to be part of revealing it or be swept away by it when it finally emerges." Wise words for such a young woman. "Painful lessons from a not-so-easy life," she responded honestly. Alexander studied her with an intensity that made her blush, and when he spoke again, his voice had taken on a softer, more personal tone. "Can I ask you a personal question?" "Depends on how personal." "Why do you work as a waitress? With your education, your intelligence, you could be doing so much more." Sophia felt the familiar sting of shame that always accompanied that question. "Because real life doesn't always let people do what they're qualified to do," she answered defensively. "Because when your grandmother gets cancer and has no health insurance, you drop out of college to take care of her and work. Because when she dies and leaves you a house but also medical debt, you take any job you can find to survive." "I'm sorry," he said immediately. "I didn't mean for that to sound like a judgment, but it was. Maybe. I'm used to a world where people do what it takes to get ahead, no matter the circumstances. I guess I forgot that not everyone has the same opportunities." The honesty in his answer surprised her. "And you?" she asked. "Did you always want to run the family empire?" "No," he replied without hesitation. "I wanted to be an architect, design buildings that people could love, spaces that would improve their lives. But when my father died, someone had to take the reins, and I was the only son." "Do you regret it?" "Every day," he admitted, and there was something so vulnerable in his admission that it made Sophia's heart ache a little. "But I also understand that I have responsibilities. Thousands of people depend on the company for their jobs, to feed their families. I can't just decide I want to do something different. It was the first time Sophia had seen beyond the successful CEO's facade, and what she saw was a man carrying the weight of decisions he had never really wanted to make. He was more human than she had expected, more complex, and if she was being honest with herself, more attractive in ways that had nothing to do with his physical appearance. "Can I ask you something else?" he said, taking another step closer. "I suppose. Why did you decide to trust me? You could have kept all this information, maybe taken it to the media or a lawyer. Why risk showing it to me directly?" It was a question she had asked herself dozens of times over the past few days. "Because," she said slowly, "my grandmother always taught me that the fastest way to solve a problem is to face it head on. And because there was something in your eyes that night at the restaurant that told me you were different from the other men at that table." "Different how?" "More real, less arrogant, like you actually saw me as a person, not just the waitress." Alexander took another step toward her, and now they were so close that Sophia had to tilt her head back to look him in the eyes. "And now? Do you still think I'm different?" The question was loaded with more than casual curiosity, and Sophia felt a shiver of nervousness and anticipation. "I'm starting to think you're more complicated than I expected," she admitted. "Is that a good thing?" "I don't know yet." Alexander smiled, and the smile completely transformed his face again, making him look younger and less intimidating. "I like your honesty." "It's all I have," she replied, trying to ignore the way his proximity was affecting her ability to think clearly. "No," he said softly, raising a hand to gently touch her cheek. "You have so much more than that." The touch was like an electric shock, and Sophia felt her breath become uneven. It was the first time a man had touched her in such an intimate way, and the fact that it was Alexander Montgomery, a man who should be her enemy, made the situation even more confusing. "Alexander," she murmured, unsure if it was a protest or a plea. "I know," he said, but he didn't move his hand. "This is complicated. It's probably a very bad idea." "It's definitely a very bad idea," she agreed, but she didn't pull away. "Then why does it feel so right?" She finished the sentence and he nodded. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibilities and dangers. There were so many reasons they shouldn't be feeling this attraction, so many ways this could go terribly wrong, but there was something in the way he looked at her, something in the way his touch made her feel, that made all the logical reasons seem less important. The ringing of Alexander's phone shattered the moment like breaking glass. He pulled away from her immediately, taking the device from his pocket with a frustrated expression. "Excuse me," he murmured, looking at the screen. "It's my assistant. I have to take this." Sophia nodded, both relieved and disappointed by the interruption. She needed a moment to compose herself, to remember why she was there and what was at stake. While Alexander spoke in a low voice on the phone, she walked to the window, watching the rain that had started to fall more heavily. What was she doing? How had she gone from seeking justice for her grandmother to being attracted to the man whose family had caused so much pain? "I have to go," Alexander said from behind her, and when she turned, she saw he had put his phone away and was straightening his shirt. "There's an emergency at the office that needs my immediate attention." "Of course," she replied, trying to sound professional and not disappointed. "But this isn't over," he added, approaching her again. "I want to see more of your grandmother's documents. I want to fully understand what happened and how I can fix this. Really." He took her hands in his, and again, Sophia felt that disconcerting electric connection. "Could you come to my office tomorrow night, after your shift at the restaurant? There are some corporate files I'd like to review with you to see if we can find more evidence of what happened." Sophia hesitated. Going to his office felt like entering enemy territory. "Wouldn't it be better to meet somewhere neutral?" "I need access to the company's files," he explained, "and after office hours we'll be alone. No one else has to know what we're investigating until we decide how to proceed." The logic was sound, but something in the way he said, "we'll be alone," made Sophia's stomach fill with butterflies again. "Okay," she finally agreed. "What time? 9? I can send a car for you." "No, I'll get there on my own." She didn't need her co-workers seeing a limo waiting for her outside the restaurant. "As you wish." He headed for the door, but stopped and turned back to her one last time. "Sophia, I want you to know that regardless of what we find, of what we decide to do, I admire what you're doing for your grandmother. It takes a lot of courage to stand up for what's right, especially when it's hard." The words touched her more deeply than she had expected. "Thank you," she murmured. "Until tomorrow night, then." After he left, Sophia stood in her grandmother's study for a long time, trying to process everything that had happened. She had accomplished more than she had hoped. Alexander had seen the evidence, had recognized the injustice, and seemed genuinely interested in finding a solution. But something else had happened too, something she hadn't planned or expected. She had felt a connection with him that went beyond her mission for justice for Eleanor. It was a dangerous and reckless attraction, but it was undeniable. As she gathered the documents and put them away carefully, she couldn't help but wonder if she was on the path to her grandmother's vindication or walking straight into an emotional trap from which she might never escape. Only time would tell. Chapter 3. The glass tower that housed the headquarters of Montgomery Enterprises rose against the Chicago night sky like a monument to power and ambition. Sophia paused on the sidewalk, looking up at the top floors where lights were still on despite the late hour, and felt a mix of determination and nervousness that made her doubt if she was really ready for this. She had spent the whole day serving tables at the restaurant, smiling at customers who treated her as if she were invisible, while her mind constantly worked on what she had discovered about her grandmother's story and what her meeting with Alexander that night might mean. Every time she thought of him, of the way he had looked at her, of how she had felt when he touched her, her stomach filled with a nervous anticipation that had nothing to do with legal documents or historical justice. The building's lobby was as impressive as she had expected. Gleaming white marble, a fountain in the center, and a reception desk that looked more like an altar to modern capitalism than a simple counter. The security guard eyed her suspiciously when she mentioned she had an appointment with the CEO, but after checking her name on a list, he handed her a temporary access card and pointed her to the elevators that would take her to the executive floor. The ride up to the 42nd floor felt endless. Sophia studied herself in the elevator's mirror, nervously adjusting the white blouse and black skirt she had chosen because they made her feel more professional, more serious. She had left her hair down, falling in soft waves over her shoulders, and had applied a little more makeup than usual, telling herself it was just to feel more confident. The elevator doors opened to reveal an elegant hallway with dark grey carpet and glass walls, offering panoramic views of the city. A single office at the end of the hall had its lights on, and Sophia walked toward it, with steps that sounded too loud in the silence of the empty building. The door was ajar, and as she approached she could see Alexander standing by a huge window, watching the city lights with a glass of red wine in his hand. He had changed out of his formal suit into dark pants and a light blue shirt, with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, and the more casual look made him seem more approachable, but no less attractive. "Alexander," she said softly, knocking on the door. He turned, and when he smiled at her, Sophia felt her resolve to keep things strictly professional dangerously falter. "You made it," he said, setting his glass on his desk and approaching to greet her. "I thought maybe you'd changed your mind." "I was tempted," she admitted honestly, stepping into the office and looking around with curiosity. It was exactly what she had expected. Large, elegant, with expensive furniture and modern art on the walls. But there were also personal touches, family photographs, books that had nothing to do with business, an acoustic guitar leaning in a corner. "You play?" she asked, gesturing toward the instrument. "A college hobby I never gave up," he replied, following her gaze. "Would you like something to drink? I have wine, water, coffee." "Water is fine," she said, still feeling she needed to keep a clear head for this conversation. Alexander went to a small bar in a corner of the office and poured her a glass of water, taking the moment to watch her as she walked around the space. There was something in the way she moved, a natural grace that contrasted with the nervousness she could see in the way her hands constantly moved, smoothing her skirt or touching her hair. "How was your day?" he asked, handing her the glass and noticing how their fingers briefly brushed during the exchange. "Long. Hard to concentrate." She took a sip of water, trying to ignore the way he was looking at her. "And yours?" "I spent most of the day going through old company files," he replied, heading toward his desk where several open boxes filled with documents sat. "I wanted to find more information about the transactions my father made in the 90s before you arrived. Did you find anything?" Alexander's expression darkened, more than I'd like. He took a folder from his desk and handed it to her. "Your grandmother wasn't the only one." Sophia opened the folder and began to review the documents, her expression gradually changing from interest to shock and finally to outrage. There are at least a dozen inventors here, all with patents that were evaluated by Montgomery Enterprises and never returned. 13 to be exact," Alexander confirmed in a tense voice, "all independent inventors, most of them without significant legal resources to fight a large corporation, and all with technologies that eventually became products commercialized by our company. This is massive," Sophia murmured, continuing to read. It wasn't just an isolated case. It was a systematic pattern. A business model, Alexander corrected bitterly. My father built the foundations of this empire not through genuine innovation, but through organized theft of intellectual property. Sophia looked up at him, seeing the tension in his face, the way his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. How do you feel knowing this? Like everything I've based my professional identity on is a lie, he answered without hesitation. Like all the employees who think I work to protect their jobs are actually working for a company built on crime. What are you going to do? Alexander walked back to the window, and Sophia followed him, standing beside him as they watched the city spread out below them. The view was breathtaking, but she noticed he didn't seem to be really seeing anything. That's the question, isn't it? He said after a moment. What does a person do when they discover their family legacy is built on the destruction of others? You do the right thing, she replied simply. No matter the cost. Even if the cost is the destruction of everything you've worked to maintain. Even if it means thousands of innocent people lose their jobs when the company collapses under the weight of the scandal? It was a more complex question than Sophia had initially considered. Do you really think doing the right thing would completely destroy the company? The lawsuits alone could do it, he replied. And that's not even considering the damage to our reputation, the loss of investor confidence, the government investigations that would surely follow. Sophia watched him carefully, noticing the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched as he considered the implications. You know what bothers me most about this whole situation, she said finally. What? That you're more worried about protecting a company built on theft than about bringing justice to the people who were robbed. Alexander turned to her sharply, his blue eyes flashing with an intensity that made her take a step back. Do you really think it's that simple, that I don't care about the victims? I don't know, she answered honestly. Do you? Of course I care. Your grandmother, all those other inventors, they deserved better. They deserved recognition, compensation, justice. But I also have responsibilities to the people who trust me now, in the present. What if there was a way to do both? Sophia asked, moving closer to him again. To bring justice to the victims without destroying the innocent? How? I don't know yet, but there has to be a way. You're a successful CEO. You have resources, connections, power. If you really wanted to find a solution, you could. Alexander looked at her for a long moment, and gradually his expression softened. You know what I like about you, Sophia. What? She asked, feeling her heart start to beat faster at the intimate way he had said her name. You never accept it can't be done as an answer. You have a faith in the possibility of doing the right thing that is refreshing. It's what my grandmother taught me. She said that complicated problems require creative solutions, not excuses. She was a wise woman. She was, and she deserved better than what she got. Alexander moved closer to her, and Sophia was acutely aware of how alone they were in that giant building, of how intimate the space between them felt. What do you propose, then? I propose we work together to find a solution, that you use your position and your resources to create something that honors the memory of my grandmother and all the other inventors, something that rights the injustices of the past without destroying the future. And what would you get out of it? Why would you be willing to work with me instead of just taking all this evidence to the media and letting the company crumble? It was a valid question, and Sophia took a moment to consider her answer. Because, she said finally, I've spent the last few years of my life watching bitterness and resentment consume my grandmother. She died angry, feeling that justice was impossible. I don't want that to happen to me. And you think working with me will give you a better chance of finding justice? I think working with you will give me the best chance of finding a solution that really matters, that really changes things for the better. Alexander extended his hand to her. Then let's work together. Sophia looked at his outstretched hand, knowing that shaking it would mean much more than a simple business agreement. It would mean trust, partnership, and possibly the beginning of something that could change her life in ways she couldn't yet fully comprehend. She took his hand. The handshake was firm, but it lasted longer than was strictly necessary for a professional agreement. Their eyes met and held, and in that moment Sophia felt she had crossed a line from which she might not be able to return. Where do we start? She asked, not looking away from his blue eyes. We start by finding the other inventors on this list, he replied, though he didn't let go of her hand. The ones who are still alive. We need to hear their stories, to fully understand the scope of what my father did. That could take time. I have time. His thumb lightly brushed the back of her hand, a gesture so subtle she wasn't sure if it was intentional. Do you have time? I'll have to see if I can change some shifts at the restaurant, she replied, trying to ignore the way that simple touch was affecting her ability to concentrate. What if you didn't have to worry about the restaurant? What do you mean? I mean, this is going to require serious full-time investigation. You could work as a consultant for the company officially. I'd pay you a salary that would allow you to quit the restaurant job and dedicate yourself completely to this. The offer was tempting, more tempting than it should be. Wouldn't that be a conflict of interest working for the company we're investigating? Not if you're transparent about your goals, and not if you have my word that you'll have full access to any information you need without restrictions. Sophia considered it, weighing the advantages and the risks. On one hand, working for Alexander would give her resources and access she could never have on her own. On the other, it would also put her in a position of dependence on him that could compromise her objectivity. And what if, at the end of our investigation, we decide that the only just solution is to publicly expose everything we've found, even if it hurts the company? Then that's what we'll do, he replied without hesitation. You have my word. The word of a Montgomery? She asked with a slightly ironic smile. The word of this Montgomery, he corrected, finally releasing her hand but staying close. My personal word, and I hope that means something different from what my father's word meant. There was something in the way he said it, a vulnerability he had rarely shown that touched something deep inside Sophia. Okay, she said finally, I accept your offer, but with conditions, which are, first, I have full access to all relevant files, no exceptions. Second, any solution we develop has to include public recognition and compensation for all the victims we can identify. And third, Sophia hesitated, unsure if she should state the condition that truly worried her. Third, this stays strictly professional, no matter what other feelings might arise. This is about justice, not about other things. Alexander watched her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Are you worried I can't keep things professional? I'm worried neither of us can, she admitted honestly. The admission hung in the air between them, charged with a tension that had been building since they first met. Alexander took another step closer, and now they were so close that Sophia could feel the warmth of his body, could see the tiny gold flecks in his blue eyes. And what if we couldn't? He asked in a low voice. Would that necessarily be a bad thing? It would be complicated, she murmured, feeling her resolve weaken with every second that passed under his intense gaze. Most things worth having are complicated. Alexander, I know, he said, raising a hand to gently touch her cheek, exactly as he had done the day before at her grandmother's house. I know. It's a bad idea. It's dangerous. It could ruin everything we're trying to achieve. Then why can't I stop thinking about you? Why haven't I been able to concentrate on anything else since I met you? Why do I feel like you're the first real person I've met in years? The words hit her like a punch to the gut, because they were exactly what she had been feeling too. This is crazy, she whispered. Completely, he agreed, but he moved even closer until she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. What are we doing? I don't know, he admitted, his voice now barely a whisper, but I can't think of anywhere I'd rather be than here. With you, right now. The air between them was charged with electricity, with possibilities and dangers in equal measure. Sophia knew she should pull away, that she should maintain the boundaries she had set just minutes before. But when Alexander bent his head toward hers, when she could feel his warm breath against her face, all her willpower seemed to vanish. Sophia, he murmured, her name both a question and a plea. She closed her eyes, surrendering to the moment, to the feeling, to the connection she had been trying to deny since the first moment she saw him. When their lips finally met, it was as if the entire world stood still. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if they were both testing unknown waters. But when she responded, when her arms rose to circle his neck, the intensity grew until it felt like they were trying to communicate through touch everything they couldn't say with words. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing unevenly, and Sophia felt dizzy from the intensity of what had just happened. This complicates things, she murmured against his lips. Yes, he agreed, but he didn't pull away. Do you regret it? Sophia considered it for a moment, looking into his blue eyes that now shone with a warmth that made her feel like she was melting. Ask me again tomorrow, she said finally. Alexander laughed softly, a sound that completely transformed his face and made her fall a little more in love with him, even though she knew she shouldn't. Tomorrow? When we have time to think clearly about what this means, about how it's going to affect what we're trying to do. And what if tomorrow we decide it's worth the risk? Then, she said, rising on her toes to give him a quick, soft kiss on the lips, I guess we'll have to figure out how to handle a very complicated situation. When she finally pulled away from him, she picked up her purse from the desk where she had left it and headed for the door, knowing that if she stayed any longer, she would completely lose her ability to make rational decisions. Sophia, he called when she reached the door. Yes? Tomorrow morning, come to the office. We'll officially start our investigation and we'll also talk about this." "About what?" she asked with a smile that tried to be innocent, but she knew wasn't succeeding. "About the fact that we just changed everything between us." "Good night, Alexander," she said, not directly answering his observation because she knew he was right and she wasn't ready to admit it yet. As she rode the elevator down as she walked through the empty Chicago streets toward the bus stop, Sophia couldn't help but touch her lips with her fingers, remembering the way she had been kissed for the first time by a man who should have been her enemy and who instead was becoming something far more dangerous, someone she could fall completely in love with. The game had changed. It was no longer just about justice for her grandmother, though that was still important. Now it was also about navigating the complicated and terrifying feelings she was developing for Alexander Montgomery, and determining if it was possible to have both, justice and love, truth and happiness. Only time would tell if she had made the smartest decision of her life, or if she had just walked straight into the heart of a storm that could destroy everything she had been fighting for. Have you ever felt your heart leading you towards someone your mind tells you is dangerous? Tell us in the comments what city you're watching from and what you think Sophia should do now that her feelings for Alexander are complicating her quest for justice. Don't forget to like this story and subscribe to the channel to find out how this complicated story of love and redemption unfolds. Chapter 4. The first rays of sun filtered through the blinds of the temporary office Alexander had set up for Sophia on the 38th floor of Montgomery Enterprises. She had been up all night, reviewing documents, organizing evidence, and trying not to think about the kiss she had shared with him just hours before. But every time she looked up from the papers, her eyes automatically went to the window overlooking Alexander's main office, waiting for him to arrive. She had come in early, at 7 in the morning, needing to keep busy before he appeared, and she had to face the conversation she knew was inevitable. Her new office was small but comfortable, with a partial view of the city and enough space to spread out all the documents they had gathered. Alexander had kept his word. He had given her full access to the corporate archives, a computer with a connection to all internal databases, and a badge that allowed her to move freely through the building. The sound of the executive floor's main door opening made her look up. Through the glass of her office, she saw Alexander walk in with 2 cups of coffee in his hands and an expression that suggested he hadn't slept much either. He wore a dark grey suit that fit him perfectly, but there was something different in his posture, a tension she hadn't noticed before. When he knocked softly on her office door, Sophia felt her stomach fill with nervous butterflies. "Good morning," he said, entering and placing one of the cups on her desk. "I thought you might need some caffeine." "Thanks," she murmured, avoiding his gaze as she took the cup. The coffee was exactly how she liked it, with a little milk and a pinch of sugar. The fact that he had remembered those details from the night before moved her more than it should have. "Did you get any sleep?" he asked, sitting in the chair across from her desk. "A little. You?" "Not much." He took a sip of his coffee, watching her over the rim of the cup. "I was thinking about what happened last night." "Alexander," she began, but he raised a hand to stop her. "Let me finish. I've been thinking, and I think we both know that what's happening between us is significant. But I also know you're right about keeping things professional, at least for now." Sophia felt a mix of relief and disappointment. "At least for now? Until we're done with this investigation, until we get justice for your grandmother and for all the other inventors. After that," he shrugged, "after that we can see what we are to each other without all these complications." "And you think you can maintain that separation?" she asked, finally looking up to meet his eyes. The smile he gave her was slightly sad but determined. "I'm going to have to, because what we're trying to achieve is more important than my personal feelings." His words both reassured and saddened her. It was exactly what she had asked for. But now that she had it, she realized a part of her had hoped he would fight a little harder for the chance to explore what was between them. "Fine," she said finally. "Then let's get started." For the next 2 hours they worked together, reviewing the files Alexander had collected, contacting the inventors on the list who were still alive. It was meticulous and often disheartening work. Many of the phone numbers no longer worked. Some addresses led to houses where the inventors had died years ago, and others simply refused to talk on the phone about such a sensitive topic. But they also had some successes. They managed to contact Charles Rogers, a 68-year-old engineer who had developed a primitive GPS navigation system in 1994, only to have his ideas evaluated by Montgomery Enterprises and never returned. They also found Maria Hernandez, a 72-year-old woman who had created a prototype of a touchscreen user interface that had been revolutionary for its time. "Would they be willing to meet with us?" Sophia asked, after finishing her call with Maria. Charles said yes, but he wants to bring his lawyer. Maria seems more reluctant, but I think if we explain exactly what we're trying to do, we might convince her. And the others. Alexander checked the list they had been working on. Teresa Sanchez died last year, but her son might have information. Roberto Mendez moved to the United States and we lost track of him. And Luis Moreno. His expression darkened. Luis Moreno is in a nursing home. His family says he developed early-onset dementia after losing all his work to my father. The information hit Sophia like a punch to the gut. Dementia? At what age? 55. His family says the loss of his inventions, the financial stress, and the feeling of betrayal affected him so much that he began to show signs of premature cognitive decline. Sophia closed her eyes, feeling the weight of decades of injustice on her shoulders. It wasn't just money your father stole from them, was it? He stole their dreams, their mental health, their futures. I know, Alexander said quietly, and every name on this list makes it harder for me to reconcile the man I thought I knew with the man he really was. At that moment, Alexander's assistant, Carmen, a middle-aged woman with a perpetually efficient expression, appeared at the door. Mr. Montgomery, your partner Mr. Peterson is here for your 10 o'clock meeting. Sophia saw Alexander tense up immediately. My 10 o'clock meeting. I don't have anything scheduled. He says it's urgent, sir. Something about an internal investigation he needs to discuss with you immediately. The look that passed between Sophia and Alexander was one of mutual understanding. Mr. Peterson was the same man who had made the derogatory comments about uneducated waitresses at the restaurant, and now he was showing up unannounced, talking about an internal investigation, just as they had begun to review the company's old files. Tell him I'll be with him in 5 minutes, Alexander instructed Carmen. When she left, he turned to Sophia with a worried expression. This can't be a coincidence. Do you think he knows what we're doing? Peterson has been with this company since my father was alive. If anyone knew about the questionable patent acquisition practices, it would be him. Alexander stood up, adjusting his tie. Stay here, don't leave this office until I get back. Why? What do you think is going to happen? I don't know, but Peterson is complicated. He's been waiting for me to make a mistake since I took over the company. If he finds out we're investigating my father's transactions, he could use it against me. Use it how? Alexander hesitated, as if debating how much to tell her. There are tensions on the board of directors about my leadership. I'm young, I took control under difficult circumstances, and some of the older partners think I don't have the experience to run a company of this size. Peterson has been building a coalition to try to oust me, and investigating your father's crimes would give him the ammunition to do it. He could argue that I'm jeopardizing the company's financial stability for emotional reasons, that I don't have the coldness required to make tough business decisions. Sophia stood up too, moving closer to him. Does that mean you're going to stop the investigation? No, he replied firmly. It means we have to be more careful about how we proceed. Alexander, if doing the right thing puts your position in the company at risk, then maybe— No, he interrupted, gently taking her by the shoulders. I'm not going to choose my career over justice. I'm not going to become my father. The words reassured her, but also worried her. There was something in Alexander's determination that made her think he was willing to sacrifice much more than he should for this cause. Just be careful, she said, and remember, you don't have to solve this all by yourself. He smiled, and for a moment the professional tension between them vanished, replaced by something more personal and warm. You know, your grandmother taught you well. You have her strength, but also something she might not have had, the wisdom to know when to ask for help. Before Sophia could respond, he was already heading for the door. Keep the door locked, he warned, and if anyone other than me tries to get in, don't open it. After he left, Sophia stood in the middle of her office feeling a growing anxiety. There was something about the way Alexander had spoken of Peterson that made her nervous. She went to the window overlooking the main hallway, trying to see if she could watch the meeting, but the angle didn't allow her to see inside Alexander's office. Instead of worrying, she decided to continue her work. There were more files to review, more names to investigate, but she had been working for only a few minutes when she heard raised voices coming from the hallway. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clearly confrontational. Her cell phone rang, and she saw a text message from a number she didn't recognize. Stop digging or there will be consequences. The message filled her with a cold terror that made her sit down heavily in her chair. Who knew what she was doing, and what kind of consequences were they threatening? Before she could fully process what she had received, her office door swung open abruptly. But it wasn't Alexander who entered, but Mr. Peterson, followed by two men in suits she didn't recognize. Miss Miller, Peterson said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I believe we need to talk." "I have nothing to discuss with you," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear she felt. "Oh, but I think you do. You see, I've been observing your activities for the past 24 hours, and I'm very concerned about the influence you're exerting over our young CEO. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't you?" Peterson walked over to her desk, picking up one of the files she had been reviewing. Patent files from 1993, documents on intellectual property acquisitions, very interesting reading for a former waitress. "Where's Alexander?" she asked, ignoring his condescending remarks. "Mr. Montgomery is busy in a very important meeting with the rest of the board of directors, a meeting about the future of his position in this company." Sophia's heart sank. "What did you do?" "We simply presented our concerns about some of the questionable decisions he's been making recently, hiring outside consultants without board approval, giving access to confidential files to people who haven't passed security checks, risking the company's stability for emotional reasons." "He's trying to do the right thing," Sophia defended, standing up. "The right thing?" Peterson laughed, a cold, harsh sound. "Miss Miller, do you have any idea how many jobs would be lost if the accusations you're trying to make public resulted in massive lawsuits against this company? How many families would be left without an income? And what about the families that were already destroyed by Richard Montgomery's thefts?" she countered. "That's ancient history, water under the bridge. But what you two are doing now threatens the future of thousands of innocent people. We're not trying to destroy the company. We're trying to find a fair way to—" "There is no fair way," Peterson interrupted. "There are only winners and losers. And if you continue with this investigation, I assure you, you and the young Montgomery will be on the losing side." One of the men who had entered with Peterson approached Sophia's desk and began to gather the documents she had been reviewing. "What are you doing?" she asked, trying to stop him. "Securing confidential company material," Peterson replied. "For these documents should never have left the secure archives. Alexander gave me permission to—" "Alexander is no longer in a position to give those permissions." Peterson's smile turned crueler. "The board has just voted to temporarily suspend him from his duties as CEO while an investigation into his fitness for the role is conducted." The words hit Sophia like a physical slap. "You can't do that." "We can, and we did. And now, Miss Miller, I'm going to give you a chance to be smart. You can take this check." He pulled an envelope from his jacket, "which represents a very generous compensation for your time, and you can forget everything you've seen here. Or you can continue with this useless crusade and face the legal consequences of interfering with a corporation's business." Sophia stared at the envelope without touching it. "And if I refuse, then we'll have to explore other options. Investigations into your past, your eligibility to work in this country, perhaps even questions about how you obtained certain information that could be considered industrial espionage." The threat was clear and terrifying, but it also filled her with a fury she hadn't felt since the night at the restaurant when she first heard this man's cruel arrogance. "Mr. Peterson," she said, straightening her shoulders and looking him directly in the eye, "you can take your check and all your threats, and you can—" "I can what?" he asked, stepping forward menacingly. "You can explain to the press why a company that supposedly operates ethically is so desperate to hide 30-year-old documents." Peterson's expression hardened. "You're making a very serious mistake, Miss Miller." "No," she replied, surprising herself with the firmness of her own voice. "A mistake was made by your company 30 years ago, and then you made it by underestimating a woman with nothing to lose." "Everyone has something to lose," he replied ominously. At that moment, the door opened again, and Alexander walked in with an expression of fury Sophia had never seen before. His tie was loosened, his hair slightly disheveled, and there was a tension in his posture that suggested he had just been in a battle. "Alexander," Sophia said, feeling a wave of relief at the sight of him. "What's going on here?" he demanded, seeing the men who were confiscating the documents. "We're simply securing confidential material," Peterson replied calmly, "and explaining to Miss Miller that her services are no longer required." "Her services are required by me," Alexander said firmly, "and I am still the CEO of this company." "Temporarily suspended," Peterson corrected. "The board has decided you need time to reconsider your priorities. The board doesn't have the authority to suspend me without just cause." "Doesn't it?" Peterson smiled. "Read the company's articles of incorporation, Alexander. Your father was very careful in structuring the corporate governance. The founding partners retain certain oversight rights." Sophia watched as Alexander processed this information, how the realization of what had happened dawned on his face. "This is a coup," he murmured. "This is business," Peterson replied, And business requires leaders who put profits before feelings. And what about doing the right thing? The right thing is to protect the jobs of 5,000 families instead of seeking justice for people who have been dead for decades. The conversation was interrupted by the ringing of Alexander's phone. When he answered, Sophia could see that the news he was receiving was not good. "That was my lawyer," he said after hanging up. "Apparently someone has filed a lawsuit against me personally, alleging that I've been using company funds for unauthorized personal investigations." "Interesting timing," Sophia observed, looking directly at Peterson. "Mistakes have a way of coming to light," the older man replied with a satisfied smile. Alexander walked over to Sophia, taking her hands in his, not caring that Peterson and his associates were watching. "I'm sorry," he said in a low voice. "This got out of control faster than I anticipated." "Don't apologize for trying to do the right thing," she replied, squeezing his hands. "How touching," Peterson interrupted with sarcasm. "But I'm afraid the time for feelings is over. Miss Miller, you have 5 minutes to gather your things and leave the building. Mr. Montgomery, I need you in my office to discuss the terms of your suspension." "No," Alexander said firmly. "I'm not going to let you intimidate Sophia." "It's not intimidation, it's a dismissal. She should never have been here in the first place." Sophia realized the situation was escalating toward a confrontation that could further harm Alexander. With a breaking heart, she made the hardest decision she'd had to make in a long time. "It's okay," she said, letting go of Alexander's hands. "I'll leave." "What? No, Sophia, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," she interrupted, looking at him with eyes that she hoped conveyed more than she could say out loud. "For now." She picked up her purse and the few personal documents she had brought, deliberately ignoring the envelope Peterson was still holding out to her. When she reached the door, she turned to Alexander one last time. "This isn't over," she said, and though the words were meant for him, she knew Peterson had heard them clearly too. "No," Alexander agreed, "it's not over." As she walked down the hallways toward the elevators, escorted by the security personnel Peterson had called, Sophia felt a mix of fury, determination, and something she hadn't expected: hope. Peterson had made a mistake by showing his hand so early. Now she knew exactly what she was up against, and more importantly, she knew that Alexander was willing to fight for what was right, even if it meant risking everything he had. The war had officially begun, and Sophia Miller, the granddaughter of a brilliant and unjustly forgotten inventor, was more than ready for the battle. Chapter 5. 3 days had passed since Sophia had been escorted out of the Montgomery Enterprises building, and every hour had felt like an eternity. She had set herself up at her kitchen table, surrounded by all the photocopies of her grandmother's documents she had managed to make before they were confiscated, trying to come up with a new strategy now that she had lost access to corporate resources. Her phone had been ringing constantly, journalists who had caught wind of the story, lawyers offering their services pro bono, and even some of the other inventors from the list who had heard rumors about what was happening. But she hadn't received a single call from the person she most wanted to hear from, Alexander. That had hurt more than she expected. She had managed to convince herself that her concern for him was purely professional, that she only cared because he was her ally in the quest for justice for her grandmother. But the lack of news from him had revealed a truth she had been trying to ignore. She had fallen in love with the man who was supposed to be her enemy. The sound of the doorbell pulled her from her melancholic thoughts. When she opened the door, it wasn't Alexander standing on her porch, but an older woman she didn't immediately recognize. She was elegant, in her 70s, with perfectly coiffed silver-grey hair and dressed in expensive but understated clothes. Her eyes, Sophia noticed immediately, were a very familiar shade of bright blue. "Miss Miller?" the woman asked in a cultured voice that had a slight accent Sophia couldn't place. "Yes, can I help you?" "I'm Isabella Montgomery," the woman said, and the surname hit Sophia like a lightning bolt. "Alexander's mother. May we speak?" Sophia was frozen for a moment, processing the information. Alexander's mother was at her door, and for some reason that terrified her more than any threat Peterson had made. "Of course," she said finally, stepping aside to let her in. "Would you like something to drink? Coffee? Tea?" "Tea would be lovely, thank you." Isabella entered the house, observing the interior with a curiosity that seemed genuine rather than condescending. "You have a beautiful home. It feels cozy." "Thank you. It was my grandmother's." Sophia headed to the kitchen, feeling strangely nervous as she prepared the tea. "How did you find me?" "Alexander told me about you," Isabella replied, following her into the kitchen. "He's mentioned your name several times over the last few days." "Have you spoken with him recently?" Sophia asked, trying to sound casual but knowing she had failed miserably. "Last night, he was distraught." Isabella took a seat at one of the kitchen chairs, looking at the scattered documents. "May I ask what all this is?" Sophia hesitated, unsure how much she should reveal to the mother of the man at the center of the whole controversy. "They're documents related to my grandmother's work, to inventions she created many years ago." "Eleanor Miller?" Isabella asked, and there was something in her tone that made Sophia look at her sharply. "You knew her?" Isabella took the tea Sophia offered with hands that, Sophia noticed, trembled slightly. "I knew of her. She was very respected in certain academic circles." "Certain circles?" "Sophia," Isabella said after taking a sip of tea, "there's something you need to know. Something Alexander doesn't know. Something very few people know. About your grandmother, about my husband, about how Montgomery Enterprises really began." Sophia's heart began to beat faster. "What do you mean?" Isabella stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the small backyard where Eleanor had grown herbs for her special teas. "Did your grandmother ever tell you about her university days, about her research collaborators? She mentioned she had worked with other researchers, but she never went into detail. Did she never mention a young engineering student named Richard Montgomery?" The words hit Sophia like a physical punch. "What? My husband and your grandmother met at Northwestern University in 1985. He was finishing his master's in engineering. She was doing her doctorate in computer science. They worked together on several research projects." Sophia sat down heavily in her chair, feeling the world shift beneath her feet. "They worked together?" "More than that." Isabella turned to her, and in her eyes was a deep sadness. "They were in love." "No," Sophia murmured, shaking her head. "That can't be true. My grandmother never married. She never had any serious boyfriends. She would have told me." "Would she have told you she was in love with a man who eventually betrayed her so deeply that she could never trust anyone again?" The question hung in the air between them, and Sophia felt all the pieces of a puzzle she had been trying to solve for years finally start to click into place in the most horrible way possible. "Tell me everything," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. Isabella returned to the table, taking Sophia's hands in hers. "Eleanor and Richard were a couple for 3 years. They worked together, dreamed together, planned a future together. She was brilliant, more brilliant than he was, and he knew it. But he was also ambitious in a way she didn't fully understand." "What happened?" "In 1988, Eleanor developed the prototypes you've been investigating, the automatic translator, the touchscreen interface systems, all of it. Richard helped her with some technical aspects, mainly the software programming, while she handled the conceptual design and hardware." Sophia felt nauseous. "So, he knew exactly how it all worked. He knew all the technical details, yes, and when Eleanor started looking for funding to commercialize her inventions, he offered to help. He said he knew investors, that he could handle the business side while she focused on the research." "But it wasn't true." "It wasn't true," Isabella confirmed sadly. "Instead of looking for legitimate investors, Richard registered the patents under the name of a company he had secretly created. He used Eleanor's work to get initial funding, and by the time she realized what had happened, it was too late." "How did she find out?" "Richard told her himself. He explained that he had protected her work by registering it corporately, and that now they could develop it together as partners. But when Eleanor read the legal documents, she discovered her name was nowhere to be found. Everything was registered as the property of Montgomery Enterprises." Sophia closed her eyes, imagining the pain and betrayal her grandmother must have felt. "And what happened then?" "Eleanor confronted him. There was a terrible fight. She demanded he correct the documents, acknowledge her authorship, include her as a co-founder of the company. Richard refused." "Why?" Isabella took a deep breath before answering. "Because by then I had entered the picture. You? I was the daughter of a wealthy family. My father owned several textile companies, had important political connections. Richard had started courting me while he was still with Eleanor. He was cheating on her," Sophia said, feeling a renewed fury toward a man who was already dead. "He wasn't just cheating on her. He was using her. When my father offered to finance his company in exchange for Richard marrying me, he decided it was an opportunity he couldn't pass up. And Eleanor. Eleanor became an obstacle to his ambitions. If she claimed co-authorship of the patents, if she demanded public recognition for her work, it could complicate his narrative of being a brilliant young entrepreneur who had built everything from scratch." Sophia stood up abruptly, walking to the window as she tried to process all this information. "Did you know all this when you married him?" "Not at first," Isabella admitted. "Richard told me Eleanor had been a minor collaborator on some projects, but that the real work had been his. Only years later, when I found some letters she had sent him, did I discover the truth." "And you did nothing? What could I have done?" By then I was married, I had Alexander, my family had invested millions in the company, and Eleanor had completely disappeared from the academic world. It seemed she had chosen to move on with her life, or he had broken her heart so completely that she couldn't go on, Sophia corrected bitterly. Probably, Isabella agreed sadly, and that guilt is something I've carried for 30 years. Sophia turned to her. Does Alexander know any of this? Nothing. Richard never told him about Eleanor, and I never had the courage to admit that our family fortune was built on such a deep betrayal. But now he's investigating. He's finding out the truth anyway. And he's in love with you, Isabella added softly. The words surprised Sophia. How do you know that? Because I know my son. I've seen the way he talks about you, the way he's changed since he met you, and because I recognize the signs. What signs? The same ones I saw in Richard when he was in love with your grandmother. The comparison made Sophia feel as if cold water had been thrown on her. We are not like them, aren't you? Isabella moved closer to her. Are you sure? A Montgomery in love with a Miller, with family secrets between you, with money and power on one side of the equation, and justice and principles on the other. Alexander is not like his father, Sophia said firmly. No, he's not, but the circumstances are strikingly similar. Why are you telling me this? Sophia asked after a moment. Why now? Isabella walked to the table where Eleanor's documents were scattered. Because I've been living with this guilt for 30 years, watching my husband build an empire on the pain of a brilliant woman. And because I don't want history to repeat itself. What do you mean? I mean that if Alexander finds out this truth the wrong way, if he learns that not only did his father steal your grandmother's ideas, but also broke her heart, it could destroy him, and that could destroy any chance of you two having a future together. Sophia felt her legs weaken, and she leaned against the wall. Do you think the fact that his father and my grandmother were lovers really matters? I think it changes everything. It makes the betrayal personal instead of just commercial. It makes what happened between Eleanor and Richard parallel to what's happening between you and Alexander. But we're not them, Sophia insisted again. Aren't you? Think about it. Alexander is risking everything for you, exactly as Richard risked everything for Eleanor's work. The difference is that Richard chose power over love, while Alexander seems to be choosing love over power. And you think that's a mistake? I think it's noble. I also think it's dangerous. Isabella picked up the purse she had left on the table. There's something else you need to know. What? Richard never stopped loving Eleanor. To the day he died, he kept letters she had sent him, photographs of when they were happy together. He often wondered what would have happened if he had made different decisions. Did he tell you that? Not directly, but after 30 years of marriage, a woman learns to read between the lines. Isabella headed for the door, but stopped before leaving. Sophia, may I give you a piece of advice? I suppose, if you really love my son, if you really believe he can be different from his father, then give him the chance to choose. Tell him what you've just heard. Let him decide if he's willing to face the whole truth, even the parts that hurt. And what if he chooses power over justice, like his father? Then you'll have learned something important about the man you're falling in love with. But if he chooses justice, if he chooses love, then maybe you can write a different ending to this story. After Isabella left, Sophia sat in her kitchen for hours, feeling as if her entire understanding of the world had been turned upside down. The relationship between her grandmother and Richard Montgomery explained so many things. Why Eleanor had never talked about boyfriends, why she had been so bitter about businessmen, why she had kept all those documents as if they were evidence of a crime. It also explained why Eleanor had been so reluctant to fight legally for her rights. It hadn't just been fear of the legal system or a lack of resources. It had been the pain of a woman betrayed by the man she loved. But the question that tortured her most was, should she tell Alexander? How would he react to knowing that the injustice he was trying to correct was not just commercial, but deeply personal? And how would that change the dynamic between them? Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Charles Rogers, the engineer they had contacted days ago. Miss Miller, his voice said over the phone, sounding urgent. Something's happened. I need to see you immediately. What kind of something? Someone's been asking questions about me, about my family, about my work, questions that make me think I might have made a mistake by talking to you. What kind of questions? The kind that suggest someone very powerful doesn't want this story to get out. Miss Miller, I think we're in danger. The word sent a chill down Sophia's spine. Where do you want to meet? Somewhere public. And Miss Miller, bring everything you have, all the documents, all the proof. I think it's time this story goes public before it's too late. After hanging up, Sophia stood in the middle of her kitchen, feeling the walls close in on her. The revelations about her grandmother and Richard, the threats from Peterson, Alexander's suspension, and now this. Everything was moving too fast, escalating into something that might be too big for her to handle alone. But maybe that was the key. She didn't have to handle it alone anymore. She had allies now, other inventors who had been victimized, a CEO who was willing to risk everything to do the right thing, and a story that was too important to keep secret. It was time to stop defending and start attacking. She picked up her phone and dialed the number she had been avoiding for days. "Alexander, it's Sophia. We need to talk. There's something about your father and my grandmother that changes everything." Chapter 6. Revolution's coffee shop in downtown Chicago was buzzing with the typical activity of a Saturday afternoon, but Sophia barely noticed the noise around her. She had chosen a table in the farthest corner, where she could have a clear view of all the entrances, and had arrived 20 minutes early to make sure she wasn't being followed. The last 4 days had been a whirlwind of revelations, desperate strategies, and decisions that would change the course of her life forever. After her phone call with Alexander, they had met secretly that same night, and she had told him everything his mother had revealed about the relationship between Eleanor and Richard. His reaction had been exactly what she had feared: pain, fury, and an almost destructive determination to correct not only his father's commercial injustices, but also the personal ones. "It's not just about money or patents," he had said, pacing back and forth in her living room like a caged animal. "It's about love. It's about betrayal. It's about a brilliant woman who had her heart broken by the man she trusted more than anyone in the world." "Alexander," she had tried to calm him, "what happened between them doesn't change what we're trying to achieve now. It doesn't change it." He had turned to her with eyes that shone with a fierce intensity. "Don't you see the parallel? My father romanced your grandmother, used her work to build his fortune, and then abandoned her for a better opportunity. How do I know I'm not repeating the same story? Because you're different." "Am I different? Or do I just want to believe I'm different?" That had been the question tormenting them both over the following days. As they worked together to develop a strategy to expose the truth publicly without completely destroying the company, the tension between them had grown to an almost unbearable level. Every glance, every accidental touch, every moment of closeness was charged with the weight of the history their families shared. Now, sitting in the cafe waiting for the others to arrive, Sophia mentally reviewed everything that had happened. Charles Rogers, the engineer whose GPS system had been stolen, had managed to contact 3 other inventors from the list. Maria Hernandez had finally agreed to meet with them after her son convinced her it was the right opportunity to seek justice. And Teresa Sanchez, though she had died the previous year, had left detailed diaries that her son had agreed to share. But the turning point had come 2 days ago, when Alexander had made the riskiest decision of his professional life. During an emergency board meeting, where Peterson had planned to finalize his removal as CEO, Alexander had done something completely unexpected. He had publicly confessed everything they had discovered about his father's fraudulent practices. "Gentlemen of the board," he had said as he later recounted to her, "you need to know that Montgomery Enterprises was built on a foundation of systematic intellectual property theft. I have documented evidence of at least 13 cases where my father fraudulently acquired patents, and I believe it is our moral and legal responsibility to rectify these injustices." The reaction had been exactly what they had expected: shock, denial, panic over the financial and legal implications. Peterson had tried to downplay the revelations as Richard's youthful mistakes, but Alexander had presented evidence so complete and detailed that it was impossible to ignore. "And what do you propose we do?" one of the board members had asked. "I propose we establish a compensation fund for the victims and their families. I propose we publicly acknowledge the contribution of these inventors to our company's success. And I propose we institute new policies to ensure something like this never happens again. And what if the lawsuits this generates destroy the company? Then we will face the consequences of my father's actions as people of integrity, because the cost of doing the right thing, no matter how high, is less than the cost of living with the lie." In the end, the board had voted to suspend any decision until they could fully assess the implications. But Alexander had achieved something important. He had forced everything into the open, had made it impossible for them to bury the truth again. Naturally, Peterson had intensified his attacks. The lawsuits against Alexander had multiplied. The media had begun to report rumors of corporate irregularities, and there had been obvious attempts to intimidate some of the inventors into not speaking publicly. But something else had happened that none of them had anticipated. The public had started to take an interest in the story. Local media began their own investigations, Intellectual property rights organizations offered free legal support, and several independent inventors from across Latin America had come forward with similar stories about corporations that had stolen their work. That was why they were meeting today. Not just to plan their next move, but to coordinate what had grown into a movement far larger than anyone had imagined. Sophia? A soft voice pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see Maria Hernandez approaching her table, an elegant woman in her 70s, with eyes that sparkled with an intelligence undiminished by age. Mrs. Hernandez, she stood to greet her. Thank you for coming. Thank you for giving me the chance to finally tell my story, Maria replied, taking a seat. Have the others arrived? As if summoned by her question, Charles Rogers appeared at the cafe's entrance, followed by a younger man Sophia recognized as Miguel Sanchez, Teresa's son. And behind them, with a look of determination she had come to know well, was Alexander. Seeing him still made her heart race, but now there was something different in the way they related. Over the last few days, as they had worked together under extreme pressure, they had developed an intimacy that went beyond physical attraction. It was a connection forged in shared goals, mutual risks, and the understanding that they were fighting for something bigger than themselves. Sorry for the delay, Alexander said as he reached the table. I wanted to make sure we weren't followed. Is there any reason to think we might be? Charles asked with concern. Peterson has hired a private investigation firm, Alexander explained, as he sat next to Sophia. Officially, it's to protect corporate interests, but practically, it's intimidation. What kind of intimidation? Miguel asked. Surveillance, background checks, attempts to find compromising information on anyone involved in this. Alexander turned to Sophia, especially on Sophia, on me. They've been investigating your educational history, your finances. They've even been asking your former co-workers about your emotional stability. The words made Sophia feel a mix of fury and violation that was hard to describe. Are they trying to discredit me? They're trying to create a narrative where you're a disgruntled former employee with delusions of grandeur, trying to extort the company with fabricated accusations. But we have evidence, Maria protested. Documents, patents, testimonies. Evidence only matters if people are willing to listen, Charles pointed out. And if they can make Sophia look like an unreliable source, they can sow enough doubt to make the story fall apart. Then we have to make sure the story is bigger than just Sophia, Miguel said. We have to make it about all of us. It was exactly what Sophia had been thinking. What do you propose? A press conference. All of us together, telling our stories, presenting our evidence. Make it impossible for them to attack one person because they'd have to attack everyone. It's risky, Alexander observed. Once we go public like that, there's no turning back. Peterson and his allies will use all the power they have to destroy us. And what's the alternative? Sophia asked. Stay silent while they control the narrative. Let the story of my grandmother, of all our relatives, be buried again. No, Alexander said firmly. There is no alternative, you're right. It's time to tell the whole truth. For the next hour, they meticulously planned what would be the most important press conference of their lives. They decided it would take place in 3 days on Thursday morning at the Drake Hotel, where they could secure a large room and media access. Each of them would tell their individual story, but they would focus on the broader pattern of corporate behavior that had affected multiple inventors for decades. What about the repercussions? Maria asked. What happens after we tell our stories? We face whatever comes, Alexander replied. Lawsuits, investigations, possibly the financial destruction of Montgomery Enterprises, but it's also possible that we'll inspire real change in how corporations treat the intellectual property of independent inventors. Are you prepared to lose everything? Charles asked him directly. Alexander looked at Sophia before answering, and in that gaze was something that made her feel her heart painfully expand in her chest. There are things more important than money or power, he said finally. There's justice, there's integrity, and there's... He stopped before finishing the sentence, but Sophia knew what he had been about to say. There was love. There was the possibility of a future built on truth instead of lies. After the others left, Sophia and Alexander sat in the cafe, sharing a silence that was charged with everything they hadn't said over the past few weeks. Are you sure about this? She finally asked. About the press conference, about risking everything? Are you asking about the press conference or about us? The question caught her by surprise, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Both, I guess. Alexander moved closer to her, taking her hands in his. Sophia, my whole life I've been living in the shadow of a man I thought I admired. I built my professional identity around continuing his legacy, of being worthy of the empire he created. But now I know the truth. And how do you feel about it? Liberated, he answered without hesitation. For the first time in my life, I have the chance to decide for myself what kind of man I want to be, what kind of legacy I want to leave. And I know I want to be the kind of man who does the right thing even when it's hard, even if it means losing everything you've worked to maintain. Especially if it means that. His thumbs caressed the back of her hands. Because I've learned that there's something far more valuable than all the money and power in the world. What? The respect of the woman I've fallen in love with. The words hit Sophia like a wave, washing away her ability to breathe normally. Alexander, I know it's complicated. I know there's history between our families. I know there are risks. I know we could end up losing everything, but I also know that I can't imagine facing any of those things without you. And what if, when this is over, when we have justice for my grandmother, we find out that the only thing we really had in common was this cause? Is that what you believe? He asked, moving closer until she could see the tiny gold flecks in his blue eyes. No, she admitted in a whisper. I think I fell in love with you the first moment I saw you helping me pick up those broken pieces of glass. I think I fell in love with your integrity, your willingness to do the right thing even when it's hard, the way you look at me as if you really see me. Then there are no more questions to ask, are there? No. The only question that matters is, are you willing to write a different story than the one our parents wrote? Are you willing to choose love over fear, truth over convenience? Sophia felt tears in her eyes, but they were tears of happiness, of relief, of the realization that she had found something she had been searching for her whole life without knowing she was looking. Yes, she answered, and when he leaned in to kiss her, she knew she was sealing something much more important than a romantic promise. She was committing to a future where they both chose to be better than the generations that came before. The kiss was soft but deep, charged with months of tension and weeks of denial. When they finally separated, they were both smiling, with a happiness neither had expected to find in the midst of all the turmoil. Now what? She asked. Now we face whatever comes together. The press conference, the consequences, everything together. Even if we lose? Especially if we lose. Because winning or losing is no longer about money or power. It's about whether we can sleep at night, knowing we did the right thing. 3 days later, as she prepared for the press conference that would change everything, Sophia thought about those words. She had put on the blue dress that had belonged to her grandmother, the same one she had worn the day Alexander first visited her house. It was her way of honoring Eleanor's memory, of carrying her with her, as she finally told the story that had been waiting decades to be told. The hotel's conference room was packed with journalists, television cameras, and representatives from inventor rights organizations. In the front row, she noticed with surprise, was Isabella Montgomery, who had sent her a text message that morning. It's time for the truth to come out. Eleanor would have been proud. Peterson was there too, sitting in the back with a barely contained expression of fury, and several men in suits who were obviously lawyers. But his presence no longer intimidated her. She had come too far, risked too much, found too much to be scared off by threats. When Alexander took the microphone to open the conference, Sophia felt a surge of pride and love that almost overwhelmed her. Seeing him stand there, preparing to destroy his father's legacy to bring justice to a woman he had never met, finally convinced her that they had broken the cycle of betrayal that had defined the previous generation. "Good morning," he began, his voice clear and firm. "My name is Alexander Montgomery, and I'm here to tell a story about lies, betrayal, and the courage it takes to do the right thing, even when the cost is everything you have." The story he told over the next hour was complete, honest, and devastating. He not only admitted to his father's fraudulent practices, but detailed each case, each victim, each lie that had been constructed to hide the truth. When he finished, the silence in the room was absolute. Then it was Sophia's turn. She approached the microphone, feeling her knees tremble, but when she saw Alexander's eyes in the audience, she found the strength she needed. "My grandmother, Eleanor Miller, was many things," she began. "She was a brilliant inventor, a polyglot, a visionary who saw the future of technology decades before others. But she was also a woman who trusted the wrong man, who had her heart and her dreams broken by someone who should have protected her." She told the whole story, the relationship between Eleanor and Richard, the personal and professional betrayal, the years of silence and bitterness that followed. When she mentioned how Eleanor had died still hoping someone would recognize her work, she saw tears in the eyes of several journalists. "But this story doesn't end with my grandmother's death," she continued. "It ends with the understanding that every generation has the opportunity to choose to be better than the last. And today we are choosing the truth." One by one, Charles, Maria, and Miguel told their stories, creating a devastating mosaic of decades of systematic corporate abuse. By the time they finished, it was impossible to deny that what had happened was not a series of isolated mistakes, but a deliberate pattern of criminal behavior. During the question period that followed, the journalists were relentless. They wanted to know why Alexander had decided to expose his own company, what compensation the victims were seeking, and what legal implications they expected. "Aren't you afraid that this exposure will completely destroy Montgomery Enterprises?" a reporter asked. "I'm more afraid of living with lies than facing the consequences of the truth," Alexander replied. "If the company can't survive doing the right thing, then maybe it doesn't deserve to survive." "And what do you say to the thousands of employees who could lose their jobs if this results in the company's collapse?" another asked. "I tell them that we will fight to find ways to protect their jobs while we correct the injustices of the past. We will establish compensation funds, create new corporate ethics policies, and work to ensure that Montgomery Enterprises becomes the kind of company its employees can be proud of. And if that's not possible, then we will face those consequences with integrity, knowing we chose to do the right thing." When the press conference finally ended, Sophia felt exhausted, but also exhilarated. They had done it. They had told the truth, honored the memory of Eleanor and all the other inventors, and set in motion events that would change everything. The days that followed were exactly as chaotic as they had expected. The stock of Montgomery Enterprises plummeted, multiple lawsuits were filed both for and against the company, and national and international media picked up the story. Peterson tried to have Alexander arrested for corporate sabotage, but the district attorney refused to press charges without clear evidence of criminal intent. More importantly, other inventors began to come forward with similar stories about different corporations, turning what had started as a personal quest for justice into a national movement to protect intellectual property rights. 2 weeks after the press conference, Sophia found herself standing in her grandmother's same study where it had all begun, but this time she wasn't alone. Alexander was with her, and together they were packing Eleanor's documents and inventions to be donated to a museum of technology history that had offered to create a permanent exhibit on unrecognized American inventors. "Do you think she would have been proud?" Sophia asked, holding the prototype of the automatic translator that had started it all. "I think she would be proud of you," Alexander replied, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "Of your courage, your determination, your refusal to let her story be lost." "And what about us? Do you think she would have approved of this?" Alexander turned her in his arms so he could look her in the eyes. "I think she would have wanted you to be happy. And I think she would have recognized that sometimes love comes from the most unexpected places, even from the son of the man who broke her heart, especially from the son of the man who is determined to be different." 3 months later, in a simple but beautiful ceremony in the garden of Eleanor's house, Sophia Miller married Alexander Montgomery under an arch decorated with the flowers her grandmother had grown. The ceremony was small, just close family, the inventors who had fought alongside them, and some of the journalists who had covered their story. Isabella Montgomery walked Sophia down the aisle, a symbolic gesture of how families can sometimes heal the wounds of the past. In her bouquet, Sophia carried a small photograph of Eleanor, making sure her grandmother was present at the most important moment of her life. The vows they exchanged were simple but profound. "I promise to choose truth over convenience," Alexander said. "I promise to protect your dreams as if they were my own. And I promise to write with you a love story that honors those who came before us by being better than they could be." "I promise you will never be unseen," Sophia responded. "I promise we will build something beautiful on the ashes of what was broken. And I promise that our love will be proof that it's possible to choose justice and happiness at the same time." When they kissed, sealing not just their marriage, but also a future they had chosen to create together, Sophia felt that Eleanor was smiling from wherever she was. 6 months after their wedding, Alexander and Sophia launched the Eleanor Miller Foundation for Independent Inventors, funded with a significant portion of the assets remaining after Montgomery Enterprises was completely restructured. The foundation provided legal resources, funding, and patent protection for inventors who might otherwise be victimized by larger corporations. Peterson had tried to fight to the end, but was eventually forced to resign when government investigations revealed his direct involvement in multiple fraudulent schemes. He was arrested and faced criminal charges. The new Montgomery Enterprises, though significantly smaller, operated under strict ethical principles and had implemented innovative policies to ensure independent inventors were treated fairly. It was a different company, built on different foundations, with different values. "Do you ever regret it?" Sophia asked Alexander one evening, as they had dinner on the terrace of their new home, a house they had designed together a few blocks from where Eleanor had lived. What could I possibly regret? Losing the empire, risking everything, choosing justice over wealth. Alexander put down his fork and reached for her hand. Sophia, a year ago I was the CEO of a company built on lies, living a life built on lies, surrounded by people who only saw me for my money and my power. Now I'm married to a woman who truly sees me, working on something that really matters, building a legacy I can actually be proud of. And you don't see that as a loss? Losing something fake to gain something real. That's not a loss. That's the best trade I've ever made in my life. That night, as they cuddled together in their bed, Sophia thought about all the ways her life had changed since that first night in the restaurant when she had translated a joke and caught the attention of a man who would change everything. Eleanor had died believing her story would never be told. Her work never recognized that justice was impossible. But she had been wrong. Her story had not only been told, but it had inspired changes that would protect future generations of inventors. And more importantly, the love she had lost with Richard had found a way to be redeemed through the love that had blossomed between her granddaughter and her betrayer's son. It was as if the universe had found a way to heal old wounds through new beginnings. "What are you thinking about?" Alexander murmured in the dark. "Happy endings," she replied, "about how they sometimes come in the most unexpected ways. Do you think this is our happy ending?" "No," she said, snuggling closer to him. "I think this is our happy beginning." And she was right. Because the best love stories don't end with, "and they lived happily ever after." They begin with two people who decide to write every next day together, choosing love over fear, truth over convenience, and justice over ease. In the study that had belonged to Eleanor, now the office from which they ran the foundation, hung a portrait of the brilliant inventor who had inspired it all. Below it, an engraved plaque bore her favorite words, "The truth always finds a way to come out. We just have to be brave enough to help it." Sophia and Alexander had found that bravery, and in doing so, they had discovered that the truest love is the one that grows in the fertile soil of justice, blooming stronger because it is rooted in doing what is right. Their story had become a legend in Chicago, the waitress who had challenged an empire and won not only justice, but also true love. But for them, it wasn't a legend. It was simply the beginning of a life built on promises kept, truths told, and the understanding that the most powerful love is the one that makes you want to be a better person. Eleanor Miller had finally received the justice she deserved. Her work was recognized, her name honored, her legacy preserved, and in the process, she had given her granddaughter the greatest gift of all, the chance to write a love story that was worthy of the brilliant woman who had come before. The house where it all began had become the heart of something beautiful and new, and on nights when the wind blew gently through the herb gardens Eleanor had planted, Sophia swore she could feel her grandmother's presence, finally at peace, finally vindicated, finally free from the pain she had carried for so many years. Love had won, justice had prevailed, and two hearts that had found each other across decades of pain had come together to create something beautiful, true, and everlasting. Did you believe Sophia and Alexander would get their happy ending after so many complications? This story shows us that true love can blossom even in the most difficult circumstances, and that doing the right thing is always worth it, no matter the cost. What do you think of this story of love, justice, and redemption? Tell us in the comments what city you're watching from, and share which part of the story moved you the most. Give it a like if you enjoyed this story of broken hearts that found a way to heal together, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that will go straight to your heart. What story would you like us to tell next time? Leave your suggestions in the comments.